It was a ballroom built to impress. The kind of space that doesn't exist to be inhabited, but to be seen. Crystal chandeliers multiplying the light in 1,000 directions. Tables with floral arrangements that cost more than the monthly salary of half the people serving them. The mixed scent of imported perfumes and champagne that only exists in that specific stratum where money has moved past necessity and reached performance. 200 people, maybe more. Navy and charcoal suits. Gowns that arrived in boxes bearing foreign names. Conversations that existed to be overheard just as much as to transmit information. The kind of party where no one is completely present because everyone is, at the same time, monitoring the room around them. In the center of it all, Rodney Miller laughed. It was the kind of laugh that takes up space, that goes beyond sound and becomes a declaration of presence. He held his champagne flute with the lightness of someone who never needed to calculate how much a bottle costs. His navy blue suit impeccable, his silver hair stiff with gel looking sculpted, and he gestured toward the back of the room with a pointed finger, like someone introducing an attraction. The attraction was Lucille. She was at the back of the ballroom with a tray of hors d'oeuvres, her faded gray uniform with the company initials embroidered on the chest, her gray hair pulled into its usual bun, shoes that had seen miles of office floors. She navigated among the guests with that invisible skill of someone who knows how to move through crowded spaces without being noticed, offering the tray with a nod, taking back empty plates without anyone needing to say thank you. Rodney approached her with the swagger of a man about to put on a show. He started gesturing wildly near her face, hands in the air, fingers opening and closing, the exaggerated expression of someone mocking what they don't understand. A buffoonish performance of what he imagined sign language to be, but which was nothing more than choreographed cruelty. The guests around them laughed, some with their mouths wide open, others with that discreet chuckle of people who want to participate, but prefer not to admit they are participating. Lucille didn't flinch. She didn't lower her eyes. She didn't let the tray tremble. She stood still, with that specific immobility of someone who had learned over decades that reacting to certain things gives them a power they don't deserve. Her eyes were fixed on him, but not on the ridiculous gestures he was making, on his lips. There was something in that gaze that, had any of the guests truly paid attention instead of laughing, would have looked different from what they expected to see on the face of a humiliated woman. There was no shame. There was none of the defeat that scene was trying to produce. There was concentration, and then her eyes moved. Slowly, with a discretion that no one in the loud ballroom noticed, she shifted her gaze from Rodney to a group of 3 men in the far left corner of the room. Men who weren't laughing at the performance, who were instead turned slightly toward each other, bodies leaning in with the discreet body language of people wanting to talk without the conversation reaching unwanted ears. The lips of the man in the gray suit were moving. Lucille read them. Not complete words, not a full sentence, but enough. Fragments that fit into a pattern she had spent her whole life learning to complete. Contract, City Hall, tomorrow, and a word that appeared twice on the man's lips with an emphasis that needed no sound to be clear. Everything. Lucille's eyes widened slightly, just slightly, enough to be real, and not enough to be seen. Rodney kept gesturing next to her face, still drawing laughs from the guests. Completely oblivious to the fact that the woman he was using as entertainment material had just read, with her own eyes, the sentence he didn't even know had been signed against him. But to understand who Lucille is, we need to leave that ballroom and go back in time. We need to go to an apartment on the other side of the city, on a modest floor of a walk-up building, where the real story begins. The apartment was small the way honest apartments are small. There was no attempt to disguise its size with strategic mirrors or furniture that promised more than it delivered. It was the space it was, and inside it, there was an order that came from care, not resources. The couch cushions had home-washed covers, the bookshelf had books organized by theme, and on the hallway wall between the kitchen and the bedroom, there were photographs. Her daughter dominated the wall. Marina at different ages, Marina in her school uniform, Marina on a trip that must have cost Lucille more than she let on for her daughter to know. And in one of the more recent photos, Marina holding a thick textbook bearing the seal of a law school, smiling with the intensity of someone who still believes they are going to change things. Lucille arrived that night, took off her shoes in the entryway with the care of someone who knows shoes need to last, and went to the bathroom before doing anything else. She sat on the edge of the bed and, with the 2 fingers that made the automatic gesture of someone who has repeated it for decades, removed her hearing aid. The silence wasn't new to her. She had grown up in it. had learned to inhabit it in a way that most people who hear well will never truly understand. The severe hearing loss came early, still in childhood, and with it came an adaptation that wasn't easy but was complete. She heard partially, enough to pick up some sounds and higher volumes, but it was lip reading she trusted. That was where she had invested decades of attention. She looked at the device in the palm of her hand. It was an old model, showing the wear of things that were used every day for too long, and that were never replaced not out of neglect, but because replacing it cost what she didn't have left after rent, bills, and Marina's tuition. Her husband had died 5 years earlier. A heart attack too fast to prepare for, slow enough to leave behind a hospital debt that Lucille had paid off in installments for 2 years. Since then, it was just her, the job at the construction firm, the paycheck that left no surplus but covered the necessities, and the certainty that Marina would finish her degree, and everything would make sense retroactively, as it usually does when you wait long enough. That night, before going to sleep, she thought about the exam Marina had the next day. A selection process for an internship at a major corporate firm, the kind of opportunity that doesn't come around often. She said nothing to her daughter about the nervousness she felt, because Marina didn't need the weight of her mother's expectations added to her own. Lucille turned off the light and lay in the dark, silently calculating, as she did every night, the steps for the next day. The next day began at 5:45 in the morning. She arrived at the firm at exactly 6 before the security guards changed shifts, before the floor's coffee was ready, before anyone in a suit stepped out of the elevator. It was her time. There was always, in those early morning hours, a different quality to the empty floors, the muffled sound of her own work without the noisy layer of the corporate environment on top of it. She liked that without ever telling anyone. Miller Construction occupied 3 floors in a downtown commercial high-rise. White porcelain tiles in the hallways, glass walls in the meeting rooms, the kind of office designed to say something about who runs the place before any meeting even begins. There was a large portrait of Rodney at the entrance of the main floor, with that smile of someone who commissions photographs of their own greatness. The other employees arrived around 8. A few greeted her with a nod. Most walked past without looking, not out of explicit malice but out of that specific indifference which is perhaps more honest than fake cordiality. She was the cleaning lady. There was a defined place for that in the invisible organizational chart of every workplace, and she was in it. Carla arrived at 8:30 with the coffee she bought at the corner bakery, the same one every day, and walked down the hall with the energy of someone who has accumulated dissatisfaction for years and distributes it in small doses throughout the workday. She was Rodney's direct secretary and had turned that role into an identity in a way that left no room for much else. Lucille. She stopped in front of her in the hallway without breaking stride, so that Lucille had to notice the vibration in the floor that someone was approaching, and turned to read her lips. Rodney's private bathroom is a disaster. Get up there. Lucille nodded. Carla had already moved on before the nod was finished. It was like that every day. There was no explicit cruelty in it, which in a way made everything more precise. It was simply the treatment reserved for someone who exists to serve, and who needs no consideration beyond the instruction. Lucille went up with the cleaning cart. It was later, after the bathroom, when she went to the boardroom on the upper floor. The morning meeting had ended, and the room needed to be reset for the early afternoon one. She walked in without knocking because she never needed to knock. The room was always empty at that hour, and started by the corner bookshelf, where the glasses and water bottles piled up. That was when she felt the door. She didn't hear it with her ears. She felt the vibration on the floor and saw, in the reflection of the glass window at the back, the door opening. She didn't move. She was behind the tall bookshelf, partially hidden, and the people who walked in didn't look toward the corner where she was. They never looked. There were 3 of them. The one in the gray suit she recognized from other occasions at the office. Someone who showed up sometimes in meetings with Rodney with the posture of a man who shares power, but prefers others to think he doesn't. The other 2, she didn't know. They turned slightly toward each other, and Lucille, with the cleaning rag frozen in her hand, did what she had done her entire life in situations like this. She focused. The lips of the man in the gray suit moved with the confidence of someone speaking in secret in a place he considers safe. Rodney, idiot, doesn't know. 30% of the shareholders, City Hall contract, tomorrow. After he signs, the company skyrockets. We take it all. She stood motionless for a moment that felt longer than it was. Then, with the care of someone who had been trained her entire life to go unnoticed, She folded the rag, put it on the cart, and slipped out of the room without the three men ever looking up. In the hallway, she stood still for a moment with her hand on the cart. She knew what she had read. She also knew what it meant. Someone was about to steal Rodney's company using the next day's contract as the trigger, and she, who had every reason in the world to turn her back, who had been treated like furniture for years, who had been humiliated at parties and ignored in hallways, was feeling something that wasn't loyalty to Rodney, because loyalty to Rodney wouldn't fit into the logic of what he had given her. It was something else. It was the instinctive refusal to watch an injustice happen when you have the information that can stop it, even when the victim of the injustice doesn't deserve much of your protection. She went to the floor with Rodney's office. He was facing away from the door, on the phone, gesturing with his free arm with the excitement of someone feeling good about their own conversation. She waited. He didn't turn. She reached out and lightly touched his shoulder. He spun around with the expression of someone who was interrupted at the best possible moment in the worst possible way. She gestured, hands in front of her face, the motion of someone needing to say something urgent, the pantomime of someone who lacks formal sign language but has real urgency. He furrowed his brow with the impatience of someone who has no time to decipher what isn't packaged in his preferred format. He covered the receiver with his hand and said, in that loud voice of people talking to the deaf the wrong way, "What? I can't understand a thing! For God's sake, grab a notepad!" The notepad landed on the counter beside her with more force than necessary. She took it. She wrote in clear, quick handwriting, "Careful with Marcus. He wants to take the company." Rodney read it, and then happened what she, in some honest corner of herself, perhaps already knew was going to happen. He started to laugh, not an embarrassed laugh, not the nervous laugh of someone considering the hypothesis before dismissing it. It was the broad, full laugh of someone who had just heard an unexpectedly good joke. He tore the paper, tore it right in front of her, slowly enough to be deliberate, and tossed the pieces into the leather trash can next to the desk. "Did you clean this room with too much rubbing alcohol today?" He had already put the phone back to his ear, the conversation resuming as if she were no longer there. With his free hand, he made a shooing motion, the kind you make to wave an animal away from a space that isn't theirs. "Go mop a floor, woman." It's hard to believe someone is capable of this. That a woman is trying to save this man from a betrayal that will destroy him, risking her own job to do the right thing, and receives torn paper and contempt in return. If you also feel this outrage in your chest right now, leave a like. Show that you are on Lucille's side because she is just getting started. She left the room with the cart and walked down the hallway without quickening her pace. But there was something different about her now. A quiet resolve that wasn't there when she walked in. Because Lucille had tried to do the generous thing, the thing that goes beyond what any obligation demanded of her. And she had been answered in the same old language. So she was going to handle this another way. The way only an invisible person can. The morning coffee at the office had its usual ritual. The third-floor break room was a small space with a round table, a microwave, and a coffee maker Carla had personally picked out because the previous one was too loud. People stopped by, grabbed coffee, exchanged quick comments, and moved on. It was the kind of break that isn't exactly rest, but exists because the day needs some articulation between one block and another. That morning, Rodney was in the break room. He told the story with the naturalness of someone who doesn't realize he's being cruel. Because he's been cruel for so long, he's lost the reference for what isn't. He gestured as he spoke, imitating Lucille's pantomime with his hands in the air, adding details that made the performance funnier with each repetition. The way stories evolve when the teller realizes the audience is responding well. Carla laughed with the complicity of someone who laughs at the boss's jokes, not because they're funny, but because laughing along is a form of power by association. She got up from her chair, stretched out her arms, and began to imitate, exaggerating the gestures, frowning with the expression of someone who understands nothing, opening and closing her hands in the air absurdly. The other two employees present laughed. Lucille was in the hallway. She had stopped because she needed to pass through the break room to reach the floor's utility closet, and she had noticed, from the movement visible through the door's glass window, that there were people inside. She gently pushed the door to see if she could get through, and it was there, at that angle, that her field of vision caught Carla in the center of the room with her arms wide making those gestures. She didn't need to hear to understand. She stood still for a second. Just 1 second. Then she let the door close slowly, noiselessly, turned the cart around and took the long way through the back hallway, which took 3 minutes longer but led to the same place. She didn't cry. It wasn't the time. Or maybe she had passed the phase where that kind of thing produced tears, and she had reached that deeper place where the pain doesn't wet the eyes, but stays, quiet and dry, somewhere below the chest. She moved on. It was during the lunch hour that she chose to talk to Carla, not because it was the most favorable time, but because it was the time when there were more people on the floor, and she reasonably calculated that the presence of witnesses made the conversation less susceptible to the worst. She approached Carla's desk with the notepad she had been carrying since the day before, wrote her request in clear handwriting, and handed it over. Carla read without hurrying, with that expression of someone reading one thing but processing another. Request to leave early, pick up daughter at college, internship selection results. She placed the paper on the desk. There's a meeting with City Hall today. You're pouring coffee. Lucille had already anticipated this. She took the notepad back, wrote one more line and returned it. Carla read, "It's my daughter's most important day. She passed the selection process. I've never asked for time off before." The paper went into the trash with a casual flick of the wrist, effortlessly, with the same naturalness one discards a used napkin. So what? Carla had already shifted her eyes to the computer screen. "Do you want a cookie?" Lucille stood still for a moment with the notepad in her hand. Then she put the notepad in her uniform pocket, grabbed the cart, and went to prepare to serve coffee at the City Hall meeting. At that moment, while pushing the cart down the hallway and calculating how much of the afternoon was still ahead, she sent a message to Marina. A short text, typed with cramped fingers on the small keyboard of the old cell phone. "Thinking of you. Call me when you get out," Marina replied with a heart and a nervous emoji. Lucille smiled at the screen for a second before putting the phone away. The meeting with City Hall took up the largest conference room on the floor. A long table, chairs for 12, the kind of environment designed for the weight of the deals that happen inside it. Rodney had arrived 40 minutes early to personally verify that everything was in place, which was unusual enough that Carla whispered to the assistant that today was truly important. Lucille entered through the side door with the tray of water and glasses. She distributed them around the seats with that automatic and precise movement of someone who has repeated it hundreds of times, leaning her body slightly, placing each glass with a care no one at the table would notice because it wasn't the kind of care people notice. The conversations around her followed the pre-meeting rhythm. Fragments of sentences, greetings, the kind of words that fill the time while everyone waits for the moment to be serious. And then she saw Marcus. He was 3 seats away, turned slightly toward the man next to him, whom Lucille had recognized from photos that sometimes popped up on newsfeeds she scrolled through on her phone. The mayor had the look of someone who had learned to appear honest with enough practice. She kept moving with the tray. She got closer to their side with the naturalness of someone simply finishing the water distribution. And focused, Marcus's lips moved with the restraint of someone speaking quietly, but without the caution of someone who truly doesn't want to be understood. There was a confidence there, the confidence of someone who knows the only person who could read those lips in that room wasn't present, or believed she wasn't. After the contract is signed, "Rodney is out. You'll get 10%. She stood frozen for a fraction of a second, the glass in her hand, the ice clinking slightly. Then the glass slipped. Not completely, not the catastrophic spill of someone losing control, but enough that the water hit the edge of the table with a sound loud enough for what she needed. Every head turned. The mayor pulled back from his chair. Rodney, on the other side of the table, looked up with an expression she knew well. She used that second of attention to pull the notepad from her pocket. She didn't have time. Rodney had already stood up and she managed to read his lips even before the sound partially reached her ears. "Get out." He gestured toward the door with all the authority of someone who doesn't need to justify the action. The guests watched with the discomfort of people witnessing a scene that wasn't on the itinerary. She tried to hold the notepad out toward him. Rodney's hand got there first. It wasn't a violent shove. It was the kind of contact that exists on the border of what can be done in public without being definitively classified. A pressure on her shoulder toward the door that wasn't an invitation, but was more than a touch. The notepad hit the floor. She walked out. The door closed behind her. She stood in the hallway for a moment, without the cart, without the tray, her ears partially catching the murmur resuming inside with the speed that conversations rebuild themselves after an inconvenient interruption. She bent down, picked up the notepad, and put it in her pocket. On the elevator ride back down, she faced away from the doors, as she always did so she could watch people in the reflection of the metal panel. But at that moment, there was no one in the elevator, and she stared at her own reflection with an expression no one else would see that day. It wasn't defeat. It was calculation. The day progressed with that specific slowness of days when you are waiting for something to happen without being able to rush it. She finished her floors, put away the equipment, clocked out, and went to get her coat from the utility room locker with the movement of someone ending their shift like any other shift. But before leaving, she passed through the parking garage. It wasn't the shortest route to the exit. It was a decision. The firm's parking garage was in the basement, with that yellowish lighting that turns anything into a thriller movie scene without needing extra effort. She walked down the service stairs she knew well because she had carried trash bags down them countless times, and reached the basement level with the quiet step of someone who had walked many floors that day and whose feet were used to making no noise. There was a car idling near the exit ramp, engine running, that didn't belong in the regular parking area. She recognized it without much thought. She had seen that model and that color when the two men in black had walked Marcus into the meeting room days earlier. She stood by a pillar, partially hidden in the shadows, and waited. Marcus came out of the basement elevator 3 minutes later. One of the men went to meet him with a folder he pulled from his jacket with the economical gesture of someone handing off something he doesn't want anyone to see being handed off. She focused on Marcus's lips from where she stood. The distance was farther than comfortable, but there was enough light hitting his face. All the documents. Ready. Tomorrow. After the signature. The company is ours. He took the folder, said something else she couldn't fully catch, and got into the car. The headlights flashed toward the ramp. She pulled her phone from her pocket. The small screen of the old model lit her face in the darkness of the basement. She opened the camera app, waited for the car to pass the ramp, and snapped a picture of the license plate the moment the street light illuminated it. Then she opened her notes app and typed what she had read on his lips. Every word she had managed to catch in order with the time next to it. She looked at what she had written for a moment. Then she put her phone away, walked up the service stairs and left through the usual gate, passing the guard booth where the security guard greeted her with a nod without looking up from his phone. Outside, she waited at the bus stop with the other people waiting, each carrying the weight of a finished workday. When the bus arrived, she got on, swiped her card, and sat by the window. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. It was Marina, a long text, bursting with words like someone who has too much to say and can't fit it into a few lines. She had passed. She was confirmed as an intern. The firm had called as she was leaving campus. She was crying on the subway and other passengers were staring, and she couldn't stop laughing at the same time. Lucille read the whole message, reread it. Then she looked out the bus window, at the city passing by outside, at the lights turning on as the late afternoon bled into evening. And for the first time that entire day, she cried. Not out of sadness, out of relief, the kind of relief that only exists when you've carried too much weight for too long and suddenly a piece of it is set down. She cried discreetly, as she did everything, her forehead resting against the cold glass of the bus window while the people around paid no attention. She wiped her face with the back of her hand, and started thinking about what to do with what she knew. Because Lucille had learned over 52 years that information alone solves nothing. What solves things is knowing where to take the right information, at the right time, to the right person. And she had an idea of who that person might be. The apartment kitchen light was on when Lucille arrived. She walked up the stairs slowly, not from bodily exhaustion, though the exhaustion was there too, but because there was something in her thoughts that weighed more than any physical distance. The steps she climbed every night seemed to tell a different story depending on what she carried with her, and tonight she was carrying a lot. The key in the lock, the door. Marina was sitting on the couch with the certificate resting on her lap, both hands holding the edges like holding something that might fly away. She looked up when Lucille walked in, and on her face was that specific mix of joy and anxiety, of someone who is happy, but realizes the person they wanted to see most hasn't yet appeared to confirm the happiness is real. They hugged before any words were spoken. Lucille felt her daughter's body in the embrace with the attention of someone who can't rely on sound to measure the intensity of a moment. She felt the warmth, felt how tightly Marina was squeezing, felt the lightness of a body that had spent the day carrying good news and could finally drop the burden of holding on to the joy alone. When they pulled apart, Marina had tears in her eyes that she tried to hold back with that smile of someone who doesn't want to seem dramatic. She pointed at the certificate, put her thumb up. First place. Lucille looked at the paper for a moment. Then she looked at her daughter, and she cried. Not her usual contained crying. Not that discreet thread she allowed herself in situations where she thought she deserved it. But a real cry. The kind that comes from deep in the chest and rises with a force that surprises the one feeling it, as much as the one seeing it. She covered her face with her hands for a few seconds, and Marina hugged her again, this time not letting go so soon. After a while, they sat at the kitchen table with the tea Marina had brewed. The certificate was carefully leaned against the wall, where they could both see it from the table. Marina pulled out the notebook that was kept in the kitchen drawer, that hardcover notebook that had become the language of their longest conversations, for when the phone battery was dead or there were too many things to fit on a small screen. She wrote in her usual slanted handwriting, "What happened? You're sad." It wasn't a question. It was the observation of someone who knows her mother's face better than most people know anything. Lucille held the pen for a moment, looked at the certificate on the wall, looked at her daughter, and she wrote. She wrote everything, not in the most logical order, but in the order things came out, which is the true order of any account carried for too long. The meeting in the room, Marcus's lips, the folder, the city hall contract, the spilled glass, Rodney's hand on her shoulder, the photographed license plate in the basement, the words noted in her phone. Marina read without interrupting. When she finished, she stayed quiet for a few seconds with the expression of someone organizing information with the part of the brain that years of law school had trained for exactly this. Then she wrote with the most serious handwriting Lucille had seen in a long time. "Mom, this is a corporate takeover coup. It has a legal name. But proof isn't just what you saw. You need documents, a witness, something they can't say is your invention." Lucille read it again. Marina kept writing. "You have what you saw, but they're going to say you made it up, that you're the deaf maid who misunderstood. You need them to incriminate themselves, and you need to record it." She spun the notebook around, grabbed her phone, and spent the next half hour teaching her mother how to activate audio recording with the screen off. Then she showed her how to leave the camera app in a discreet mode. Lucille paid attention with that concentration Marina had learned early on to recognize in her mother. The focus of someone who knows attention is the most expensive resource that exists and isn't going to waste an ounce of it. When they finished, it was past midnight. Marina wrote one last thing before closing the notebook. "Are you sure about what you read?" Lucille took the pen, wrote a single word. "Yes." Marina nodded, closed the notebook, and went to wash the teacups with the seriousness of someone who has just entered into something and knows there is no pretending she hasn't. Lucille sat at the table for a few more minutes, looking at the certificate leaning against the wall. Then she went to sleep. She arrived at the firm 40 minutes before her usual time. The night shift security guard recognized her and opened the gate with his usual nod. No questions asked, because Lucille had arrived early enough on other occasions that it didn't seem unusual. She went up the service stairs, walked through the locker room, and grabbed her cart with her methodical everyday calm. Her phone was in her uniform pocket with the recording activated. She had learned the night before that the app kept running even with the screen off, and had tested it in the apartment 3 times until she was sure. The battery was fully charged. The storage space, she had checked, was enough for hours. Marcus's office was on the 2nd floor, down a hallway she cleaned on Wednesdays and Fridays. It wasn't her assignment this Tuesday morning, but she had a logic prepared for being there. There was a bathroom in that same hallway that needed restocking, something she had checked the day before and intentionally noted to use as an excuse if anyone asked. No one asked. The hallway was empty at that hour. She went into Marcus's office with the cart, left the door cracked as she always did, and started by the window corner with her rag. The desk's side drawer was sticking out slightly. She noticed it by the wrong angle, not completely open. Not an obvious oversight, but that extra millimeter of someone who closed it in a rush and didn't double-check. She had seen drawers like that countless times. Sometimes there were documents inside that needed weight to close properly. She pulled it with 2 fingers. The folder was folded to fit, with a law firm's logo on the cover, and papers spilling slightly out the side like they had been shoved in without being organized. She opened the first divider. Contract. Corporate transfer terms. A table with names she recognized as company shareholders next to figures indicating acquisitions already completed. And in the top right corner of one of the pages, a date. Tomorrow. She pulled out her phone. The photos were quick, each page flipped with the care of someone who doesn't want to leave handling marks. The morning sunlight coming through the window hitting the paper from an angle she adjusted slightly to keep the letters legible. She didn't count how many photos she took. She went all the way to the end of the divider. That was when the door opened wider. She didn't hear it. She felt the slight vibration on the floor and caught the movement in her peripheral vision. She put the phone away in the same motion she used to close the folder, a gesture that took less than 2 seconds, but felt like it lasted much longer in the internal rhythm of someone whose heart is racing, but can't let it show. George was big, with that kind of physical presence that takes up space unintentionally, and over the years he had developed the habit of walking into rooms without realizing he hadn't announced his arrival, because he was the security guard, and the rooms were all equally his territory. He looked at her with that open expression of someone who isn't suspecting, just observing. "Lucille, everything okay?" She saw him speak, smiled with that naturalness she had cultivated as a second skin over the years. The smile of someone who is where she always is, doing what she always does. She gave a thumbs up. George looked at her for a second longer than normal. There was something in him, in that extra second, that she recognized as the presence of a doubt he was choosing not to investigate. Not out of complicity, but out of that practical generosity of someone who likes the person they are looking at, and prefers not to create problems where there might not be any. He nodded slowly, glanced briefly at the drawer, and walked out. She waited until she could no longer feel the vibration of footsteps in the hallway. Then she breathed. The photos were on the phone. The recording was still running. She closed the drawer, reorganized the cart, and finished the hallway at her usual pace, wiping down the threshold of the exit door just like she always did. When the elevator reached Rodney's floor, she had decided she wasn't going to wait anymore. The doors opened and he was inside, stepping out into the hallway with his suit jacket draped over his arm and his phone in his other hand, carrying the posture of someone who is already in their next meeting before leaving their current one. She stepped into the elevator before the doors closed, facing him, and blocked the control panel with her body. Rodney looked at her with the expression of someone calculating how much time this is going to take. She pulled the phone from her pocket and opened the gallery, turned the screen toward him. He looked. His eyes scanned the images with the speed of someone used to processing documents, and she saw in his eyes the moment the recognition set in. A second where his face changed, where his habitual arrogance gave way to something else, something she had rarely seen in people like him. Genuine surprise. And then the elevator reached the bottom floor and the doors opened. Carla was in the hallway, next to Marcus. The two were talking with the familiarity of people who had arranged to be there. And when the doors opened and they saw them together in the elevator, Lucille saw in Marcus a fraction of a second of quick evaluation before his face returned to a professional neutral. Rodney looked at the phone in his hand, looked at Marcus, and then the thing she had calculated as a possibility, but which still hurt when it came, happened. He laughed. "This is photoshopped." His voice was loud enough for the whole hallway to hear. "You're trying to extort me? You, the cleaning lady?" He turned to Marcus with the phone held out like he was presenting a curiosity. "Look what she did. The deaf maid is trying to con me with forged documents." Marcus looked at the phone, then looked at Lucille with that smile that wasn't a smile. It was the expression certain people develop to use in place of a threat when there are witnesses around. "This is serious, Rodney," he said slowly. "We could sue." Rodney waved his hand. "No, just fire her, get rid of her." The phone went from Rodney's hand to Marcus's with the casualness of someone passing a random object. Marcus looked at the screen for a moment with that calculated expression. Then he threw it on the floor. The sound of the impact was the kind of sound that needs no context to be understood. The screen shattered into fragments that scattered across the white porcelain of the hallway, like tiny shards of something that couldn't be fixed. "You lying deaf freak," he said. Those were the words she read on his lips, with that absurd clarity that lip reading has in moments when you'd rather not understand. The security guards arrive the way they arrive, when they've already been told to come, with the efficiency of men executing an instruction rather than a personal decision. One on each side, hands on her shoulders, marching her toward the exit with the firm pressure of someone following protocol. She didn't resist, didn't scream, didn't try to pull her arms free. She walked with them holding the same posture she had when she first walked into that building, and the second time, and every day that followed, because she had learned very early on that certain kinds of dignity only exist when no one can strip them away by force. The revolving door in the lobby, the pavement outside, and then the rain, which had started while she was still in the elevator, and was now coming down with the intensity of a storm not planning to stop anytime soon. She stood on the sidewalk for a moment, holding the purse she had grabbed from her locker before being escorted out, with no phone, no job, the rain running down her hair and her gray uniform, soaking through in real time. She looked at the street. Across the way, standing on the opposite sidewalk, was a young woman holding a small box wrapped in colorful paper, who had come to deliver a surprise and had walked into a scene she wasn't expecting. Marina had come with the cake. They looked at each other across the width of the street with the rain between them. Marina crossed without waiting for the light, forgetting about the box in one of her hands, and when she reached the other side, she hugged her mother with a force disproportionate to her body size. The box pressed between them, the rain soaking them both equally without distinction. Marina was crying. Lucille felt the sobs through the vibration in her daughter's shoulders, through the damp heat of her face against hers, through the way her daughter's body shook in that cry that was made of anger and helplessness and love all at once. She didn't cry. She stood in the rain holding her daughter with both arms, looking over her shoulder at the glass building across the street, with the composure of someone processing a defeat and transforming it, right there, in that moment, into material for something else. We have to pause here for a second, because what you just heard, the smashed phone, the man who should have been saved handing the woman trying to save him over to his own enemy, the revolving door and the wet pavement, this isn't the worst thing that's ever happened to someone. But it's the kind of thing that happens when a person uses the invisibility of those no one notices to try and do good, and gets punished for exactly that. If you feel outraged by this injustice, leave your like now. Show that you are on Lucille's side because she's standing in the rain, but she is still standing. The cake box was crushed on one side from the hug. Marina pulled back slightly, looked at her mother with a face drenched in a mix of rain and tears, and made the sign they had shared since Marina was a child. Their index fingers pointing at each other and then pulling apart, the gesture they had invented together that wasn't official ASL, but was theirs. Now what? Lucille looked at her daughter, looked at the crushed cake box, looked at the rain that kept falling. She signed back, adding a movement that wasn't in their vocabulary, but that Marina understood the same way you understand anything said by someone you know better than yourself. Now it really begins. The bus had that late afternoon crowdedness that turns any commute into involuntary intimacy with strangers. Bodies packed too close. The smell of damp clothes multiplied by the number of people who had been caught in the same rain. The steam rising from jackets creating that low fog that only exists inside public transit on days like this. Lucille sat by the window with her purse on her lap and her eyes on the glass, but she wasn't looking at the street. She was staring at a point that was on the inside, in a place with no geographic coordinates. Marina was next to her with the crushed cake box at her feet and her notebook open on her lap, but she hadn't written anything. She watched her mother with that worried attention of someone who knows asking questions right now won't help. That presence is more necessary than any word. The bus stopped at a red light. Lucille didn't notice the man approaching until he was already 2 seats away, standing in the aisle with his hand on the metal overhead rail, looking at her with an expression that wasn't the look of someone staring by chance. He was elderly, maybe 70, in a suit that had been a good one in another era and that carried the specific dignity of clothes that have been treated with care long enough for the wear to look like history instead of neglect. Completely white hair, wire-rimmed glasses, and that gaze of someone who has spent decades organizing numbers and developed, as a byproduct, the ability to see patterns where others see noise. He pulled a piece of paper from the inside pocket of his jacket. A pen. He wrote something in small, precise accountant's handwriting and leaned in slightly to hold the paper out to Lucille. She looked at the paper before looking at him. "Are you the Lucille who worked at Miller's? I saw what they did to you." She raised her eyes to his face with that mix of high alert and exhaustion of someone who has been through too much that day to immediately know how to feel about a new variable. Marina had read it over her mother's shoulder. She turned to the man and made the universal gesture of someone waiting for more. He took the paper back, wrote some more, handed it back. "I was the company accountant. They forced me to retire 2 months ago. I know everything." The bus lurched forward as the light turned green with its usual jolt. Lucille held the paper for a moment, feeling the specific weight of a sentence that opens a door without yet revealing what is on the other side. She looked at the man, then looked at Marina. Marina had already pulled down the empty folding seat in front of them, motioning for him to sit. He sat down facing them, his knees almost touching Marina's, pen and paper ready, like someone about to give a testimony he had rehearsed without knowing who he was going to give it to. He wrote in that controlled handwriting of someone who chooses every word before forming it. Rodney is not the true owner of the company. Lucille read it. Read it again. He kept writing in blocks, handing over each piece before writing the next, like someone building an argument with the awareness that the order matters. The company belonged to Hubert Miller, his father. He built everything from scratch. Rodney is not his biological son. He was adopted when Hubert married his mother. Rodney always thought he was the sole heir because that's what he was told. Lucille furrowed her brow slightly. There was something in the direction of all this that she couldn't quite follow yet, like walking into a conversation halfway through when the references haven't clicked into place. Anthony wrote more. Hubert had a daughter before, with his first wife. There was a car accident, the first wife died, but the baby survived. She was given to relatives to raise, humble relatives, upstate. Marina was reading over her mother's shoulder with the focus of someone reading a legal brief, line by line, skipping nothing. "Who is she?" Marina asked out loud, then caught herself and jotted the same question in the notebook, turning it to the man. Anthony didn't answer right away. He reached into the inside pocket of his suit coat with the gesture of someone guarding something that can't just be tucked away carelessly, and pulled out a clear plastic sleeve with the caution of a man carrying something fragile. Inside was a photo. He slid it out of the sleeve with 2 fingers, holding it by the edges, and placed it on Marina's notebook facing Lucille. It was an old photo, yellowed with that specific tint that decades give to printed photographs, a color that isn't damage but time. A young woman, maybe in her early 20s, holding a newborn baby with that exaggerated care of the first few days, when it still feels like the baby might break. The woman was looking at the camera with a smile that reached her eyes. Lucille looked at the photo. And then something happened that Marina had never seen in her mother. Lucille's face changed in a way that wasn't an expression. It was recognition. The kind of recognition that bypasses thought, that goes straight from the eye to somewhere deeper, older, where the things you knew before you knew them live. The woman in the photo was Lucille's sister. Lucille had grown up with her, had slept in the same room for years, had seen that face at every possible age before losing her, and was now seeing it again in a photo that made no sense existing where it did, holding a baby that Lucille had never met. Her hand lightly touched the edge of the photo. Anthony placed the paper in front of her before she had to ask. Hubert Miller was the father of the baby your sister is holding. It wasn't an official relationship. He never publicly acknowledged it, but he left a will, a notarized document filed at the county clerk 3 years before he died. In it, he leaves 51% of the company to his biological daughter. He paused. Then he wrote slower, with the deliberation of someone who knows the next sentence is the one that changes everything. That baby is you, Lucille. You are Hubert Miller's daughter. You are the rightful heir to the company. Rodney never knew you existed. The bus kept moving with that indifference buses have, stopping at stops, taking on and letting off passengers, the driver shifting gears over speed bumps, the automated voice announcing something Lucille couldn't hear, and that didn't matter. She stared at the paper for a time that was too long for anyone to measure comfortably. Then her hands began to shake. Not the hands of someone who is cold, but the hands of someone who has been holding something too heavy for too long, and suddenly discovers the floor is closer than they thought. A tremor that starts in the fingers and climbs up the arm and reaches other parts until the whole person is vibrating with the frequency of something that has collapsed without falling. Marina tossed the notebook aside and grabbed her mother by the shoulders. Lucille didn't fall. She leaned slightly forward, her head lowering toward her clasped hands in her lap, with the movement of someone trying to contain something that is too big for the internal space available. Marina held her, with both arms, her chin resting on her mother's shoulder, offering that silent presence that was all she could give, and that was, in that moment, enough. Anthony waited. When Lucille lifted her head a few minutes later, her eyes were dry. She had cried without the tears showing, the way she had always done, internalizing what would be a spectacle in other people. She grabbed Marina's notebook, wrote to Anthony. The documents, where are they? He answered on the paper with the precision of someone who guarded the information as carefully as he guarded the photo. Hidden. A copy with a trusted county records office. The original with me. But there is an urgent problem. He wrote down the date of the City Hall contract. The time. And then he wrote the words that turned this revelation from something that could be handled with time into a problem with a deadline. After Rodney signs tomorrow, Marcus's coup is consolidated. The company changes its structure. Contesting it after that will mean years of litigation. With lawyers they will pay to drag everything out. Before the signature, the will documents can block the contract. After, it becomes a long battle, and you will probably lose by exhaustion. Lucille read it. Marina read it at the same time. Marina raised her eyes to the man with that new expression that had settled on her face since that afternoon. An expression Lucille recognized because she had seen it grow over the last few years. The expression of someone who is no longer a student and is becoming what they studied to be. She wrote in the notebook, slowly, with every word carrying weight. Which county records office? What time do they open tomorrow? Anthony looked at her with the gaze of someone evaluating and approving all at once. He wrote down the address in clear handwriting. Marina turned the notebook toward her mother. Lucille read the address, read the time. Read the date of the contract she had mentally noted during the meeting where she had dropped a glass on purpose and been shoved out of a room by a man who, she had just discovered, had spent his whole life sitting on a throne that belonged to her. She looked at her daughter. Marina wrote in the notebook with the firmest handwriting of the whole afternoon. Mom, we're going after them. For your sister. For you. For everything they took from you without you ever knowing it was yours. Lucille stared at those words for a long moment, with the bus moving, the rain still falling outside, her sister's photo in her hand and the accountant's paper resting on her knee. Then she closed her fingers around the photo with the care of someone holding on to something that was lost for a long time and will not be let go of again. And she nodded. Morning arrived with that specific clarity of days that are going to matter. Lucille had slept little, not out of restlessness, but in that quiet state of high alert of someone who knows the next day is going to demand the best she has. She got up before the alarm, went to the bathroom, and spent a few minutes looking in the mirror with the attention of someone preparing for something that goes beyond appearances. She opened her closet. There was a dress in the back, carefully folded on a shelf that was rarely used. Navy blue, simple fabric, clean cut. She had bought it for Marina's graduation, which was postponed and then ended up happening on a day she was scheduled to work a shift and couldn't attend. The dress had been put away ever since, waiting for a day that justified wearing it. She put it on with the same calm she applied to everything. Marina was in the kitchen with Anthony, who had arrived early with the folder of documents he had guarded for 2 months, waiting for the moment they could be useful. The lawyer he had contacted, a middle-aged man with the sobriety of someone who had undercharged for years, and decided this case was the invoice that would balance the scales, was sitting with his glasses on the tip of his nose, reviewing every page for the 3rd time. They left at 8:40. The bus ride this time was silent between them, each in their own rhythm of preparation, like athletes who have already done the training and are in the locker room before stepping onto the field. Lucille kept her purse on her lap, her sister's photo inside it, not because she was going to use it, but because she wanted her to be present. The entrance to the firm had the same porcelain tiles, the same company logo etched into the glass wall, the same security guard at the desk who had seen Lucille walk through that door, hundreds of times with a cart and a gray uniform. Today he saw her in a navy blue suit, head held high, with a daughter beside her carrying a leather briefcase, and an elderly man who looked like he had returned from where he'd been exiled with the patience of someone who waited for the exact right moment. Carla was at the reception desk. She saw Lucille and her face cycled through a rapid sequence of expressions, surprise, then recognition, then that rigidity of someone who is going to wield authority because they have no other tool available. She stood up and blocked their path with her body, speaking with the energy of someone hoping volume will solve what her argument won't. Marina didn't wait for her mother to need to make a gesture. She pulled her wallet from her bag in a precise motion, flipped it open to her State Bar intern card with her name and registration number, and held it up to Carla's eye level with the serenity of someone who has discovered that the best way to use authority is to never look like you need it. My mother has a meeting with the board of directors. Her voice was clear and calm, projected just enough to reach the entire reception area. Step aside. Carla looked at the ID, looked at Marina, looked at Lucille, and then looked at the security guard at the desk, who looked back at her without moving a muscle, because he had worked in that building long enough to recognize when a situation had escalated past a secretary's jurisdiction. They walked past. The elevator went up in silence. Lucille stood facing the closed doors during the ascent, and Marina stood next to her without saying a word, and it was in that 30-second silence between floors that Lucille did the only thing she needed to do before walking into that room. She closed her eyes for a moment, took a deep breath, and thought of her sister. Not a specific version, not a distinct memory. Just her. The presence that had existed, and that had unknowingly produced a daughter who grew up upstate thinking she was nobody, and who had spent decades cleaning the floors of a company that was hers. The doors opened. The hallway had its usual bustle, employees walking by with folders and cell phones, conversations that paused for a second when the group of three stepped off the elevator, because there was something about their composition that didn't fit the expected pattern for that time in that place. The boardroom door was partially open. Lucille pushed it. Rodney was at the head of the table with his pen in hand, leaning over the contract documents, with the mayor on the other side, and Marcus next to him, wearing the smile of someone in the final stretch of a long con, savoring the last few yards. There were 4 other men scattered around the table, aides or lawyers or both, the kind of scene that was about to be photographed by someone to be framed and hung on a wall. Rodney looked up when the door opened, and his face instantly turned the color of someone receiving information their system wasn't equipped to process. He stood up, his chair scraping against the floor. "What is this?" His voice filled the room with the force of someone who is terrified and translates fear into volume. "Call security right now." Marina stepped 2 paces ahead of her mother. "Security?" She looked around the room with a calm that was, in that context, the most destabilizing thing possible. Great. They'll be needed when they find out they are about to witness the signing of a fraudulent contract involving a corrupt public official. The silence that followed had that specific quality of silences that happen when everyone in the room has processed what was said, but no one knows yet who is going to respond first. Anthony walked to the table with the folder in his hand and set it on the surface with the calm gesture of someone depositing documents he had worked on alone for 2 months, just to reach the moment of depositing them. The lawyer opened the folder and began distributing copies around the seats with the efficiency of a man who has done this many times. "The documents you are receiving," he said in the voice of a man accustomed to rooms like this who doesn't need volume to carry weight, "are the original last will and testament of Hubert Miller, notarized in 1987 and filed under the registry indicated on the first page." He paused. "Lucille is the biological daughter of Hubert Miller, legitimate owner of 51% of the common shares of this company. Mr. Rodney, legally speaking, has always been an appointed manager, never the majority owner." Rodney stood frozen with the pen still in his hand. "Lies." The word came out as a reflex before thought. "This is a lie. My father never had another daughter. I will sue all of you for—" "You can sue the county," the lawyer said, without raising his voice. "The document has 38 years of public record behind it. The handwriting analysis and authenticity verification have already been requested, and the preliminary report is on the last page of what you are holding." Marcus had been quiet since Anthony walked in. There was something in his silence that was different from Rodney's silence. Rodney was in visible collapse. Marcus was calculating. He moved toward the door with the kind of casualness that only exists in people who have practiced discreet exits enough to make them look unintentional. The 2 security guards Marina had called from her phone on the way up in the elevator were standing right outside. The door didn't open for him the way he expected. The mayor had remained seated with the expression of someone evaluating whether there was still a version of this scenario where he could walk away without direct consequences. He pulled his phone from his pocket. The phone never got the chance to be used. The hallway door opened from the other side. 4 people walked in, wearing windbreakers and badges that needed no further explanation for anyone in the room to understand what they represented. Anthony had sent the evidence of corruption to the federal authorities the week before, complete with the documentation he had gathered over his 2 years working as the company's accountant, logging irregularities with the meticulousness of someone who had been labeling folders by year since 1986. The timing had been calculated for this exact morning. Marcus and the mayor were escorted out with the bureaucratic efficiency that the law possesses in those rare moments when it finally works. The documents on the table were seized as evidence, and the aides left voluntarily with the speed of people who decide that the best time to not be associated with a thing is while that thing is actively unraveling on live television. Rodney stood still. He was alone at the head of the table that had been his for so many years, holding a pen over contract documents that would never be signed, surrounded by the remnants of a room that had just emptied itself of all his allies in less than 10 minutes. He looked at Lucille and said, in a voice that had entirely lost the volume of the past few years and shrunk into something almost unrecognizable coming from him, that small voice that exists beneath all arrogance when the arrogance runs out. "Lucille, I didn't know. I had no idea you were. I never knew. Please forgive me." She looked at him for a moment. Then she took the notepad Marina had in her bag, picked up a pen from the table, and wrote in clear, steady letters. She handed the paper to him. He read it. And as he read, his hands grew less steady and his eyes shifted with the progression of someone rereading every line of a story he thought he knew, only to discover he was wrong in every single chapter. "You humiliated me in front of 200 people. You called me crazy when I tried to save you. You smashed my phone and threw me out in the rain. You laughed at me while I cleaned the bathroom of an office that was rightfully mine. I don't ask you to understand all of this right now. I ask that you never forget a single line of what you just read. And now, mop up the floor of your own downfall." The silence that followed was the kind that doesn't need sound to be heard. "Now I have to ask you something, and I want you to really think before you answer. You heard what Lucille went through. The public humiliation, the firing, the smashed phone on the floor, 52 years of dignity tested by people who treated her like she didn't exist. And in the end, when she had all the power to destroy Rodney completely, she chose the words she chose. Would you, in her place, have done the same? Would you have handed him that piece of paper and walked away? Or would you have done it differently? Write in the comments what you would have done. I want to know what you think." 6 months passed with the speed time has when it is being used well. The office had changed in a way that required anyone who knew it before to take a second to pinpoint what was different, because it hadn't been a renovation of vanity, it had been a renovation of intention. The lighting was adjusted to be brighter in the hallways. The meeting rooms were equipped with accessible visual communication panels, and on a wall on the main floor, right where Rodney's portrait used to hang, there was now a simple plaque for the inclusion program for deaf and hard-of-hearing employees that had been launched in the second month of the new management. George was running the facility management with his usual gentle seriousness, now with his own desk, and an intern who consulted him on protocols with the respect of someone recognizing real competence. Marina had an office in the legal department with the door always half open, where stacks of case files coexisted with a plant she watered every Monday, and a whiteboard filled with color-coded notes that only she could fully decode. Lucille arrived at 8 in the morning. Not at 6, not anymore, because there was no reason to arrive at 6 other than habit, and she had decided with the self-awareness of someone who examines their own habits after a massive turning point, which ones were worth keeping, and which were just the residue of a life that had already changed. She drank her coffee in the same space as always, the third-floor break room, but now the people walking by greeted her differently, not with the protocol of someone greeting the boss out of obligation, but with the naturalness of greeting someone who knows everyone's name and remembers the details people share about their lives. It was on an ordinary Tuesday morning that he walked in. There was a delivery for the finance department, a medium-sized box, nothing special. The delivery driver had come through reception, signed the log, and was being escorted down the hall when he passed the break room door. Lucille was facing away, holding her coffee mug, texting Marina on her phone about a document that needed approval before lunch. She turned around by chance, with the natural movement of someone shifting to put their mug in the sink, and she saw him. Rodney was wearing the uniform of the delivery company where he had ended up, after months of trying to rebuild something out of the little that was left after the lawsuits, the debts, the unraveling of everything he had built on a foundation that had never been his. His silver hair was less stiff. His posture had lost that performative verticality of someone who needs to be seen from far away. Their eyes met. He stopped. On his face was that specific expression of someone who had been expecting the worst and discovered, over the last few months, that the worst takes shapes he hadn't imagined. Not the dramatic worst of the movies, but the everyday worst of being invisible, of not having your name recognized, of carrying boxes through floors that used to be yours and realizing the floor holds no memory of who walked on it. Lucille looked at him for a moment. Then she walked over to the counter, grabbed a piece of paper and a pen, and wrote something slowly. Folded the paper in half. Walked over to him and handed it over. He opened it. Inside was a single sentence, and beneath it, an object she had attached to the paper with a paperclip. The sentence read, "Can you clean the boardroom?" And the object was a cleaning cloth, folded into a square, clean, the exact kind she had used for years in that very building. Rodney stood staring at the paper and the cloth for a time that was silent in a way silence rarely is, with the density that comes when a person is rereading their entire life in one small object. A tear fell. Then another. He said nothing. There was nothing to say that wouldn't make everything worse, and perhaps he knew that. Perhaps it was the first truly wise thing he had ever learned. Lucille picked up her mug, turned toward the window overlooking the city below, and stood there while her coffee cooled in her hand, and the morning sun poured through the glass. This story teaches us that the invisibility of those the world ignores sometimes hides the power the world should fear most. That dignity does not wear a uniform. That time, when inhabited with patience and purpose, always finds a way to put everything in its rightful place. If you like stories about real justice, about women the world underestimated, who didn't ask permission to take up the space that was always theirs, subscribe to the channel and hit the bell to join our family. Because as long as there are stories like this to tell, there is a reason to keep listening.